minutes after the hour, or you can even write. I mean, we're just waiting for people to join. We'll start soon, and then
Yes.
we are on business. So good. So I started webinar now.
We're gonna wait a little bit, give people the chance to join. Okay, shall we start?
Sure.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. My name is Murtadha Al Malallah. I'm a fourth year PhD candidate at King Abdullah University of Science and Technology. My work focuses on synthetic volcanics from the geochemical point of view. And today, I'm happy to host two experts on Red Sea research. Here in this webinar, we have Professor Froukje van der Zwan, who is an assistant professor of earth science and engineering at King Abdullah University, KAUST. Also, we have Professor Francesca Benzoni, who's an associate professor also at KAUST. In this webinar, we're going to talk about the Red Sea Rift from both the geological and the biodiversity aspects through these experts. And I would like to welcome our experts and ask them to introduce themselves and their presentation, starting with the geology of the Red Sea Rift through Professor van der Zwan.
Thank you, Murtadha. I will share my screen then so that we go
Yes, please.
dive in directly. All right. So I will take you to the deep of the Red Sea from a geological point of view. And we will talk about volcanoes, brines, and you will see what the fields of golden fluff are that we have in the Red Sea. Of course, this is not just my work. There's many people that were involved in this work, including several colleagues here from KAUST, from biology side, colleagues from GeoMar, as well as our host Ocean Quest. And we have been on many expeditions where we had many participants as well as crew expeditions that were making this work even possible. And apart from the people that were from outside, I also have my working group here at KAUST. We work on volcanoes in general, so both on the volcanoes in the Red Sea, which is what I talk about today, but also volcanoes here on land in Saudi Arabia. And we have many enthusiastic PhD, master students, postdocs here that helped also with this work, including actually Murtadha, that is, forgot to mention that he has also been very active at the work in the Red Sea. So to dive right in, well, actually not right in the Red Sea, let's first say a few words about volcanoes, because that's what I work on and why this is important for the Red Sea. So volcanoes we find worldwide on two different types of locations. We find them within plates. They are formed by hot areas, hotspots in the mantle, but we find them mostly along plate boundaries. And if we think about plate boundaries, then we have often there's a sort of a cycle of plate tectonics where we start with a stable continent. Then the next step is where we start rifting this continent and we will form two plates. And if this continent breaks up, then we will form oceanic spreading. Now we form a new oceanic plate, a young ocean. This will continue. We form a big ocean like the Atlantic. At some point, plates will move together again, maybe on the other side of the Earth. And this plate, the oceanic plate, will go under the continent, subduct. At some point, then the ocean is completely closed. When two continents collide on each other, we will form a mountain. And then we have erosion, and we're back at the beginning. Now, the Red Sea is a very good place to study these first two steps of continental rifting, as well as oceanic spreading. So this is the motivation behind many of the works that we do in the Red Sea, because it is really a type example of a young ocean after continental breakup. The Red Sea is a very slow spreading ocean, or slow, the two plates are moving apart very slow. They are separating between 1 and 1.6 centimeters per year. That's much slower than your fingernails are growing. And in the center of the Red Sea, we have this narrow basin, which is up to about 3,000 meters in depth. Now, the Red Sea started rifting about 30 million years ago when the continent started to break apart. Then there was a period around 20 million years ago where both the connection to the north and to the south was closed, and as partially the Red Sea was drying up, we formed lots of salt deposits. These salt deposits are important for lots of things in the Red Sea, as you will see in a moment. Breakup on the continent and the actual ocean spreading is highly debated. In the southern Red Sea, we can actually see it. There, it's more than 5 million years ago that happened. The rest I come back to in a few slides. So if we look at the Red Sea, we can look at different things. So I have here 3 images of the Red Sea. On the left, we have the bathymetry, so the depth of the Red Sea. Then we have also gravity and magnetics. And when we look at the Red Sea, we see that it's a little bit patchy, particularly if we go to the central parts. Then there are areas that are deeper and there are shallower areas in between. And from the 60s, 70s, these deeper areas have been called the deeps of the Red Sea. And they were always thought to be where we have oceanic crust forming. Now, the gravity and magnetics are a little bit more difficult to interpret. We also see this patchiness. And as a result, we had many models that have been formed over the years to explain the geology of the Red Sea. Now, we don't need to go into the details of the models. What we can see is the blue areas, that's oceanic crust, and you see it goes from just a little bit of oceanic crust to oceanic crust throughout the whole Red Sea. We also see faults, the black lines in all directions. Important thing is it's highly debated. Models don't agree with each other. There was one model in the 80s, 90s, which has been quite a leading model for a long time. And this was the model of spreading nodes, where we have in the southern Red Sea a continuous Red Sea spreading, so oceanic crust formation, and in the north, in each of these deeps, we had where we have nodes of oceanic crust, but in between, in the so-called intertrough zones, continental crust. However, there's still a lot of uncertainties. When I started working on the Red Sea, where is this transition really between continent and oceanic crust? And what are the magmatic and hydrothermal processes as well that are playing a role in the Red Sea? So I started working in the Red Sea around 2010, and we had several expeditions in the Red Sea since then, in the early years, with some German ships and the Dutch Pelagia. Then when I started at KAUST here 6 years ago, we could use the ships that we have here at KAUST. And afterwards, we also had access to some larger ships, some larger expeditions in 22, as well as in 23, which not only had a large ship, but it also had equipment like AOVs, which is sort of underwater drone, as well as ROVs, which is like a robot on the cable. So, and with these expeditions, we managed to get the first higher resolution bathymetry of the Red Sea along most parts of the rift. And one of the things that is very apparent with this higher resolution bathymetry is that these intertrough zones show very smooth structures, like something is flowing. And you see here the right image, there we have one of these intertrough zones, and yeah, you really see flow structures, and it looks actually very similar to the left image, which is ice glaciers. And indeed, another study around the same time found that these intertrough zones are formed by salt glaciers. So I told you earlier, we had this Miocene salts being deposited about 20 million years ago. And salt is always a little bit flowy, so that goes into the rift when we start opening it. Now the question is still, what is underneath the salt? Do we have oceanic crust? Do we have continental crust? So we can have a look at the deep parts, which is in between these intertrough zones. And if we look at those basins, we see features that are actually very typical for a mid-ocean ridge. So we see here in the map a big round area that is a big dome volcanoes. You also see many, many small round things that are all small little volcanoes. We have big volcanoes in segment centers. We have deeper areas around it. This is all very typical of a mid-ocean ridge. Something else which is very known from these deep areas, and that's important later when we talk about hydrothermal activity, is that in the deep areas we have brine pools, and they result from this salt partially being diluted, and then we have a salty fluid, salty seawater, which goes to the deepest parts because it's just heavier and then sits in these deeps. But in general, these areas are quite typical of a normal mid-ocean ridge. Now, then we also had a look at the chemistry of the rocks that we found in there, and we don't need to go into the details of what all the chemistry means. Important is in the triangular plot, we see an oceanic part, we see a continental part, and apart from in the very south, where we have a little bit more complicated situation, the rest of the Red Sea is, we see normal mid-oceanic ridge basalt. Also, if we look at sodium 8 content, which is a sort of a proxy for how much melt we had, we see a continuous change which is related to the spreading weight in the Red Sea. So based on the chemistry, we do not see any evidence of continental contamination, which is what we would expect if between the deep oceanic areas we would have continental crust. Then we had a closer look at the northernmost one, which would be really a place which was in earlier times thought to be right in between continents. And for this area, Mabahes Deep, there were multiple models, pull-apart basins, a big fracture zone, or also mid-oceanic crust. So we had, together with colleagues here at KAUST, study on this volcano, again, higher resolution bathymetry. And I said already on this volcano, because right next to the deep, we have something which really looks like a big dome volcano, nice caldera in the middle. And we also went down with an ROV, got video material, and what we see is a typical pillow basalt as we find at any mid-ocean ridge. Also in terms of chemistry, we can compare our chemistry to continental crust, which is the yellow dot, as well as the oceanic field, which is the big circle. And also there we don't see any input of continental crust. So even in the northernmost part, we see a typical dome volcano, which is also very typical for ultra slow spreading ridges, and we don't see any evidence for continental crust. So all of our deeps indicate that we have oceanic crust. We also thought there's probably oceanic crust in between. But then when did spreading start? How do we figure out when we actually started to have oceanic spreading in the Red Sea? So for this, we use other data, magnetics, as well as earthquake data, but also gravity data. And particularly, it's called VGG data, which is a derivative of the gravity. And in this gravity data, we can see some very specific features that are related to these big dome volcanoes that we have in some segment centers. Because in the image down here, you see one of these dome volcanoes, which has been split up by tectonics, then it grew again, it was split up again, it grew again, it was split up again. And if you look into gravity, it would look something like this rift perpendicular line of higher gravity. And when we start looking into the gravity of the Red Sea, then we indeed find many of these rift perpendicular ridges all throughout the Red Sea. And this is really a feature that is only known from mid-ocean ridges, from other places. You don't find something like this on the continent. And the nice thing of this gravity data is that we can actually look under the sediments. So in the bathymetry, we do not see these traces, but with this gravity data, we can look under the sediment. And with this now, we can come up with a new model, which looks something like this, whereby the blue is all oceanic crust, the dark blue is what is exposed at the moment, the lighter blue is what is covered partially by salt, and then we have the continent only at the outer margins. And the idea is that when we started forming the Red Sea, in the beginning we formed these evaporites, then when we start spreading, we are moving away the plates, we form oceanic crust relatively early, but the evaporites, because they're a little bit flowy, they will start moving to the center. And the current situation looks something like this, whereby in the northern Red Sea, we have still large parts being covered by salt. In the southern Red Sea, where spreading is a little bit faster, most of the part of the rift is open. We can also calculate the age from this, which is something like 30 million years ago, which is much older than was previously thought. And it also means that the Red Sea sort of instantaneously started spreading rather than in steps. Now then we can have a look closer at the rift, now that we have the big model of how the Red Sea is looking geologically. And we had a closer look at the volcanism. And in the Red Sea, we see a lot of different morphologies. So we have cone volcanoes in the very south, which actually have a different chemistry. We'll say another word about those a little bit later. But we also have flat top volcanoes, dome volcanoes. They are quite typical for any mid-ocean ridge. But what is quite nice on these volcanoes is that they can actually tell us something about the history of the volcanism. So flat top volcanoes are actually not very well understood how they are formed. They are flat. Sometimes they have a crater. I got the chance to actually go diving to one of these flat top volcanoes at 2,000 meters depth with the submarine. And what we found in this dive, as well as in later, more recent observations, is that many of those are formed by pillow basalts. And these pillow basalts are quite typical for slow eruption speed. Now, if we compare the amount of flat top volcanoes compared to dome volcanoes throughout the Red Sea, we see that our flat top volcanoes are in green in our plot. We see that in the central Red Sea, we have much more flat top volcanoes than in the north and in the south. We checked with chemistry if there's any relation to the chemistry, but that's not the case. But we can also check with the deeper mantle signatures that we can get from geophysics. And in our image, we see that the areas with the least flat top volcanoes are areas that are relatively slow in speed, which indicates that our mantle is hotter. So areas where we have a hot mantle gives faster eruption rates, which leads to more dome volcanoes, whereby the areas in the center of the Red Sea that are colder give slower eruption rates and form these flat top volcanoes. So that way we can learn a little bit about how volcanism in the Red Sea is formed. Another very interesting feature in the Red Sea is volcanic craters. They are found in these intratrough zones. And though there's different models for how a crater in general could be formed, we could rule out some of these other models. And in addition, we had some seismic studies going over these craters. And in the seismic studies, we see that underneath a crater, the volcanic basement is actually coming up in the form of a volcano. So right now we think that these craters are formed by explosive volcanism, probably some interaction between the melt and the salt. And this again confirms that we have oceanic crust under the ETZ, consistent with the model that I showed earlier. Now this is looking at the bathymetry from a larger area. We can gain a lot, but if we want to go really into detail, we need to have better bathymetry, because this is in the image, the ship bathymetry. We also got from this area the first high resolution AUV bathymetry from the Red Sea. And with this data, we can get much more insight on the volcanic cones that we have. We see lots of faults present. And this kind of data we can use together with chemistry, which is from the areas where we have the yellow stars. And from this area, we could see that we have relatively high amount of magmatism compared to how much spreading is, which is not usual for this kind of spreading rates that we have. We also saw that we have different morphologies. So the central image where we have different colors that are all different morphologies. Some volcanoes are smoother, some volcanoes are a little bit more rough. And this is unrelated to the chemistry. We see that they all have sort of a similar source, little bit different amounts of crystallization, but they're all quite similar. So based on these different morphologies, as well as the frequency of these eruptions, we can see that we actually have different volcanic phases, and that eruptions happening every 100 to 250 years in this area. So that means that along the whole Red Sea, we actually have relatively often an eruption. We just don't see it because most of the time, or all of the time, it's more than 1,000 meters depth, so we would not necessarily notice that on land. Now, the last thing that we also looked at regarding the volcanoes is looking at these cone volcanoes in the south. And I already said earlier, the south is a little bit different, a bit more complex, because there we have influence from a hot mantle plume, the Avar plume. And in the diagram, you see that there's some chemistry. Most of the samples from the northern Red Sea are all the same, but there's one sample, and that's the one from the southern Red Sea, which is a bit different. And this is typical for this Avar plume material. So it was known that there was something there, but there were only very little samples from the Red Sea. And we now got much, much more samples with all our expeditions. And with this, we can start saying something about how the Avar plume is actually influencing the Red Sea. And also how it looks like, because there have been different models. There's some sort of the big model of one plume. There are models with multiple plumes. There's also a model whereby the plume is not one big concentric plume, but rather sort of a leaky plume that is using plate boundaries. And we have here in this area a small plate, which is called the Danakil or Arata plate, which you see in the central lower figure. And looking at the chemistry, we found that there are differences between the different samples that we have. And particularly in the area where we have these cone volcanoes, we have a different chemistry, so that are our red samples in our plots, also in the red field in the lower plot. Again, you don't need to know what the chemistry exactly means, but in general, the higher trace element, higher sodium potassium contents are for the Avar plume, the lower samples are a typical mid-ocean ridge. So we see here that at the point of this cone volcanoes, which is exactly at the plate boundary of this Arata plate together with the Nubian plate, is where we have influence from the Avar plume. So based on that, we can say, okay, the first two models don't really work. And instead, we have a sort of a leaky plume, which is moving material into the Red Sea via this plate boundary to the side. Now, this is very theoretical, geological. For us, it's really interesting, but it also has implications for biology, for example, because these shallow seamounts are some of the shallowest seamounts within the Red Sea, and they come to 300, 400 meters. And I'm sure Francesca will say a little bit more about those, because these are areas where animals like to sit. Because in general, a lot of animals, benthic animals, like our volcanoes, like us. Everyone likes volcanoes, and indeed, many of the places where we have been, where we have collected samples, we found small animals in and around our volcanic areas. This is just some photos. Francesca will tell much more about this, and I will move on with the rocky part. Because before she will say something, I will point on another aspect from volcanism, and that is about hydrothermal activity. Hydrothermal activity is when seawater is penetrating into the crust. It gets heated up by a magma chamber. The heated fluids come to the surface. And if we have focused venting of high temperature fluids, then we form this kind of black smokers. And these black smokers are very important for cooling of the crust. They are important for mineral resources, as well as often a host, at least in other oceans, for chemosynthetic communities. So other places, these areas have really been found to be the hotspot of biodiversity in the ocean. Now, in the Red Sea, hydrothermal activity has been known for a long time, but it always looked a little bit different than any other place, because the activity that was found was in the form of metalliferous sediments and hot brines. And the sediments were also in the brines, typically. So these brines are the result of evaporites being dissolved, going to the deepest part. Now, the brines themselves are not hydrothermal, but if you have a brine, this is a dense water body sitting there, and if you have hydrothermal fluids pumping into these brines, then they sort of get trapped and then precipitate sediments. Now, these sediments are have quite a bit of copper, gold, silver in them. So this is something which is known. But these brines can also be relatively hot, up to 70 degrees. They're very saline. And with expensive equipment, you don't really want to go in a high saline 70 degrees brine. So no one has actually observed the hydrothermal venting. We think it's there, but no one really saw it. The only other evidence for hydrothermal activity is from Seamount Deep, but those chimneys were reported as being inactive. So one of the first things we did was going back to Seamount Deep and have a look around. We did that both with the limiting factor, the submarine, as well as with 2 ROVs. And it's really an amazing place. So these chimneys, they're still standing there. Some of them are really big, 2-3 meters. And they are still inactive. We haven't found any present venting, but we took samples to learn a little bit more about venting in the past. And what we found was that there is actually, even though we're in a very sedimented basin, sedimentary environment, there's very little sedimentary input, probably related to big faults that are controlling these chimneys, and that temperatures are sort of intermediate temperature, a little bit over 100 degrees to 200 degrees Celsius. At the moment, these chimneys are places where we have some corals and sponges. At the same time, we also still have quite a few questions on this area. However, they were not active. So we still were with the problem, where are the active hydrothermal vent fields in the Red Sea? And even if we take into account that there are maybe some active sites in the brines, if you think about statistics, and this is a plot that shows you how many vent fields are expected based on the length of a rift for each place, and I've highlighted the Red Sea here, we would expect something like 10 to 15 fields in the Red Sea. Also, in earlier study that I did, we looked at basalt chemistry, morphology, and there's different places where we would expect to have hydrothermal activity. So when I started at KAUST, we started searching. The first thing what we did was looking at water column signals, because if you have venting into the water column, you get anomalies in temperature, in turbidity, in the oxygen potential. So the first thing we did was making transects to the water column, and indeed we find some of these signatures, which are the red spots in the Wrigley diagram, as well as some signatures in AOV data. Well, however, the navigation of these places was not, of our studies was not very good at that moment. So we could not really pinpoint where things were. At the same time, we got AOV bathymetry data, which was in high resolution. And if you look at the map, then there are several circles. And in these circles, we have areas that are a little bit rougher. And this is not typical for a mid-ocean ridge volcanic terrain. So it looked a little bit different. So we thought like, okay, maybe this is related to hydrothermal activity. And when we went down, this is what we found. Indeed, we found hydrothermal activity. And you see in the little video that these hydrothermal fields are actually venting. Now, you don't recognize the black part, but if you look very carefully, you can see that there's a little bit shimmering of water, and that indicates a higher temperature compared to the surrounding. In the meantime, we identified 43 fields in AOV data, and 15 of those we have been down and have confirmed that are all the dark orange ones in the interpretation map. And interestingly, all these areas together, if we just look at the area, it's a huge area. So a single field can be 1-2 kilometers in size. And if we just add all these areas and compare that to other vent fields worldwide, then Hatiba Mons, which is the place where we found our volcano, our hydrothermal vent fields, is much bigger than all of the other known hydrothermal vent fields worldwide. I do need to say that many other vent fields have not been mapped out as good as that we have, but still it's a significantly larger area than many other places, at least active ones. So the Galapagos place is also relatively big, but that is inactive at the moment. The other interesting thing is that we found only this shimmering water, low temperature venting, somewhere between 40 and 60 degrees were the highest temperatures that we measured. And the rocks themselves are not these sulfide chimneys, but instead they are iron oxides or hydroxides. And the other thing what we did not expect is that we did not find this specialized vent fauna, so not the shrimps and the mussels, which are on top of many of the other vent fields, but we did find them to be a habitat for millions of organisms. They're just very, very small, because our vent fields are covered with microbes, and all the yellow that you see in this area and also in the previous images are microbial mats. And some of these places are really just completely yellow. There is so much presence there. Our colleagues, microbiologists, they have been looking at what's actually in these microbial mats, and they found bacteria, archaea, fungi, viruses. They are thermophilic, so they like to have it relatively warm. They are also important for iron precipitation, and many of the microbes that they found are actually unknown species. So there's really a lot of diversity in these microbes, and many of those have never been described before. The other interesting thing is that if you look at the rocks that were formed, the precipitates, then we see that many of them have features that look microbial. So we actually think that not only are the hydrothermal vent fields important for the microbes, but also the microbes are actually building up some of these iron precipitates. And just to give you an impression of, I say they're big, but how big is big, right? So here we have the Red Sea, and in the circle we have our Hatiba Mons volcano. And we're zooming in, and on Hatiba's Mons we have the Madjara Mount hydrothermal vent field. This vent field is around 1-2 kilometers in diameter, and on there is a few hundred meters big mount in the center. And now we're going to this mount and just flying a very short section over this larger mount, and on this larger mount we have many, many small mounts. And on this small mounts we have this microbe, so all this yellow fluff is microbial mats coming out. You see a little bit the orange tones, that is the iron oxides. And this is really a place that looks like sort of a winter wonderland underwater. I think it would be very nice for the average shrimps to have a ski holiday here. This is really an amazing place, and that goes for really hours. You can go into this kind of landscape with an ROV. So that's really amazing to see that. Now, after this one vent field, we were not satisfied. We wanted to find more because we thought there must be more. So we had one more expedition with the German Meteor. And we looked throughout the whole Red Sea, and we went from having only some indications of vent fields plus our one area to now knowing 6 areas with hydrothermal activity. And these areas are from the very far north to the very far south. We have different depths. The deepest is almost 2,000 meters. The shallowest is something like 400 meters. And most of those areas had also more vent fields. So Hatiba already had 43, but also many of the others where we often only had very short time to actually look around. We found often multiple vent fields. So this really shows that there is a lot to be discovered still. The interesting thing is all of these areas are still low temperature venting. Clear fluids, And the mountains themselves are formed of iron oxide and not sulfide. So there are a little bit of differences between them, but they all look very similar. So what about the high temperature venting then? We do see a little bit of variation within the Red Sea if we measure the fluid. So the further north we go, the higher the temperature seems to be, something about 60 degrees. Although we do not have that much data that we can really confirm that this is the case. But then looking really at higher temperatures, 200, 300, 400 degrees, if we look at the precipitates, we can look at the chemistry, the elements that are in there. And we see that some of our samples actually have quite a bit of copper and zinc, and that are elements that indicate that we need to have some higher temperatures to mobilize those. So this indicates that at some point, at least the fluids had higher temperatures, maybe at depth. And indeed, when we did some coring up to 3 meters in Hatima Mons, we found pyrite, sphalerite, barite, and anhydrite that are all minerals that indicate potentially higher temperatures. And some fluid inclusion data in the barites, very preliminary, only was measured last week, indicates also temperatures of more than 300 degrees. So we think there may be something hotter, deeper going on, but this is still really work that is in progress. Now, another very interesting feature that we found was smoky areas in the far north. So this is not really the black smoke. It also doesn't seem to be very hot, but there's definitely some fluids, particles, and gas coming into the water column. And also in the right figure, you see, this is water column data, that there is some variation in things that are actually added to the water column. And then one of our nicest discoveries was something which looks like this, which is brine pools again. But in contrast to the well-known brine pools throughout the rest of the Red Sea, which are occurring in the deepest areas, these brine pools occur on the top of a volcano. So we can't have evaporites going down in the deep because they would need to rise up. So right now we think that these brines are actually hydrothermal brines, and that we had fluids getting enriched in salt when they went down into the crust, and that these hot, then heated fluids, high saline, are coming to the surface and then are relatively dense, cooling down, forming these kind of brines. So this is a completely new type of brine, have not been described anywhere else in the world, and we are now working on the data chemistry also to try to understand these much better. And then a final word about the hydrothermal vent fields. I said we didn't have any specialists, but we did find quite some animals around it. So this is maybe a habitat after all. And also within all this microbial fluff, we found all sort of small creatures, and also that is work in progress. So yes, that is it from my side. And so in the last years, we found a lot of very exciting things in the Red Sea. And this is just the beginning of our research. And we really hope to continue for a longer time here to try to understand the volcanic and the hydrothermal processes, as well as related to this, the deep Red Sea ecosystem. And this is where I then will pass over to my colleague, Francesca Benzoni, who can tell you much, much more about the ecosystem in the Red Sea.
Thank you, Professor Zwan. Wonderful presentation, and congratulations on your work. It is very fascinating to see such geological activity happening so deep in the ocean, such as volcanism and hydrothermal venting. And it's also interesting, as you mentioned, to learn how these natural inorganic activities influence the biodiversity in the region. So it is very interesting. And with that, we would like to move to Professor Benzoni, who will tell us more about the biodiversity in the deeps of the Red Sea. The mic is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Froukje, for introducing so well the container and the amazing uniqueness of the Red Sea as a nascent ocean. I will focus more on the exploration of the biological and ecological aspects of the Red Sea. And the keyword here is uniqueness. I will start with presenting briefly my work in my lab. So I've established my lab at KAUST 5 years ago when I moved for the first time there. In the lab, we studied a structure, composition, and distribution of benthic assemblages from shallow to deep. And we are specialized in studies on corals and associated organisms through an integrated systematic approach. So it's a lot of nerdiness to explain how we try to understand what lives in the Red Sea, why, how, and what they do in terms of building habitats. And also, we would like to know how unique these habitats are. So in my career, I started working on shallow water coral reefs dominated by reef building corals. And then throughout the second half of my career, I've transitioned to the deep. And that's when I met fantastic people like my colleague Froukje, who is holding me down into the deep exploration. We are based at KAUST, conveniently located on the east side of the Red Sea. And it is an amazing place to be. Froukje has done a tremendous job at explaining how unique the geological history of the basin is. The fact that it is relatively new, that it's still spreading, and there's much happening at depth. I approached the Red Sea for the first time from the shallow water perspective, and it was already clear that it was a place on its own. If you look at the map here, very simplified, you will see that in the yellow polygon, there is the Arabian region, and the Red Sea is there, quite isolated from the rest of the wider Indo-Pacific region. So there's already an element of isolation. And then as we zoom in, we see that the Red Sea is kind of a contained basin. And the only way for fauna or flora or water to go in and out of the Red Sea until men decided to dig the Suez Canal is in the south. And it is the Strait of the Bab el-Mandeb. It's a quite narrow strait. It is a sill. Today, its maximum depth is around 100 meters. So there's not a lot of exchange with the nearby Indian Ocean. So we have unique geological history, isolation, both geographical and in terms of water flow. And then we have latitudinal gradients, meaning that within the Red Sea, many aspects of marine oceanography are actually different between the north and the south, and they also change between summer and winter, indicating that seasonality is quite strong. Here you have sea surface water temperature in winter and summer, and you can see, of course, that there is a change in temperature between two seasons. So we're not really in strictly tropical conditions, although we have in the shallow tropical biota, but we also have this kind of trend from north to south. And this is true for temperature, for salinity, for nutrients. So although it seems like a simple, small ocean, the Red Sea is actually very variable in itself. And this variability, this diversity of conditions and this peripheral situation, this isolation, has led to organisms that we can collectively call biota that is diverse, more diverse than in the nearby regions around Arabia, and endemic, so unique. You can only find it in the Red Sea. So here we have a classic figure by Di Battista et al. 2016. They showed for different mega groups of organisms. Here I summarize for corals, fish, echinoderms, and mollusks going from top to bottom. Both an idea of the species richness in the panels on the left-hand side, and then the percent endemism in the panels on the right-hand side. And what you can see is that whether you look at species richness or percent endemism, regardless of the group, the Red Sea is always red. And in this case, red means high numbers. So high number of species and high percent endemism. Meaning what? That uniqueness that I showed you in the previous slides of environmental conditions reflect on the uniqueness of the fauna and flora found in the basin. So diverse and endemic. in my lab, and since I came at KAUST, we focus on corals, on these invertebrates that are apparently simple, deceivingly so, because although they have a jelly-like body, they are actually able to build skeletons. And these skeletons somehow build ecosystems. In fact, we refer to corals as ecosystem engineer animals. Ecosystem engineering animals can be macroalgae, can be oysters, can be sponges, and of course, corals. What are the typical qualities of an ecosystem engineer? Well, they basically modify the surrounding habitat when they install and build communities, because they increase the structural complexity, they modify the current flow of the water, they affect resuspension and buffering of sediment, and they can stabilize the substrate. So basically, when these organisms take over, they change the seafloor. They change the way the seafloor works, and they allow other species to eventually colonize and interact with them. Overall, they modulate the resources for other species. So those organisms that are ecosystem engineers are the foundation of what have been described as marine animal forests. Much like the forests on land that are dominated and structured by plants, by trees, marine animal forests are dominated and structured by filter feeding organisms that form complex three-dimensional habitats and aggregate diversity. Also, they change and support complex biogeochemical cycles and affect the carbonate budget. Shallow water coral reefs, here an example from the Red Sea, are a classic example of marine animal forests. Every organism that you see there is an animal. It's a coral. And as you can see, they cover completely the structure. Now, hard corals, there are the culprits in this picture, deposit a carbonatic skeleton. So they actually, generation after generation after generation, together with other benthic organisms, are responsible for the buildup of coral reefs that are geological structure covered by these communities of corals. Coral reefs worldwide are known because they provide multiple ecosystem services, from coastal protection to support tourism or fisheries, but they also are threatened. And so the interesting element here is that Red Sea marine animal forests, coral-dominated Red Sea marine animal forests, are not only found in shallow environments, but also found in mesophotic and deep environments. Of course, the deeper we go, the less we know about them historically, because their exploration is more challenging. And some of them, especially the deeper ones, were still largely unexplored when I reached KAUST 5 years ago. And it seemed like a nice space of opportunity to develop a new line of research. So Red Sea marine animal forests occur in these zones. These zones are defined by the amount of light, of sunlight, that reaches the seafloor. So in shallow environment, we have what are called euphotic or well-illuminated, well-lit conditions. In the mesophotic environments, we're in sort of a twilight zone where there's still enough light to support light-dependent organisms, but not enough to have the same fauna and flora that you have in the shallower part. And then in the deep, we are in the dark. And that's where the fun begins. In mesophotic and deep environments, corals can be dominant and form the mesophotic, the marine animal forests. And for this talk, I'm using the term coral very loosely to refer to the three major habitat-forming corals, namely black corals, here visible as whips, gorgonians, here are sea fans, and hard corals that are similar to the ones that build the shallow water reefs without an important ally. That ally would be a symbiotic microalgae that is light dependent and so cannot live in at these greater depths, and supports physiologically the coral and makes it a better and faster calcifier for the formation of reefs. So if I summarize the occurrence and the knowledge of corals in the Red Sea from shallow to deep, I see that there is a clear steep decline of known diversity for any of these coral groups growing from shallow to deep. Also, these corals are not equally relevant or important components of marine animal forests, depending on the depth. In shallow water reefs, we have marine animal forests dominated by hard corals that are in symbiosis with those photosynthetic algae that I mentioned before. As they go deeper in the mesophotic, they become increasingly less symbiotic to become completely asymbiotic in the deep. Black corals are present throughout the depth range, but like gorgonians and sea ferns, become increasingly more abundant with depth. However, from a functional point of view, although these three categories of coral all aggregate diversity and all build habitats, from a geological point of view, if Froukje doesn't shoot me from there, they perform and fulfill different functions. In fact, only hard corals produce carbonates and therefore modify the topography of the seafloor, forming frameworks or reefs that persist after the death of the organisms. So when they're alive, they perform similar functions, but when they die, what leaves a skeleton behind is a hard coral. So all these marine animal forests are characterized by the typical diagnostic criteria that have been identified by the FAO for vulnerable marine ecosystems. They are unique or rare. They are functionally significant for the habitat. They are fragile. They can break easily. We don't know how fast they grow in the Red Sea and how fast they can recover in the Red Sea, but we know from outside the Red Sea that they're quite slow-lived. And of course, they're structurally complex. When we look at the definition, the indicators of vulnerable marine ecosystems worldwide, this is the list of VMA indicators and habitats provided by the International Council for the Exploration of the Sea. And as you can see, corals of different kind are always there to define a vulnerable marine ecosystem in shallow or depth waters. So they really are foundational organisms. Now that I have made clear and persuaded you that they are worth studying, let's say that studying corals is not as easy in the shallow when we can scuba dive and access the ecosystems from the coastline as in the mesophotic or deep. So while we can still access and observe in first with our own eyes shallow water marine, coral-dominated marine animal forests in the Red Sea, as we go down with the depth, the advent and the importance of technology becomes increasingly clear. For example, this picture that you see of a mesophotic coral ecosystem in the Red Sea here at the bottom has been taken with my iPhone within a submarine. So in order to have that kind of proximity with the ecosystem, you have to be able to dive in very high technology and high cost assets that need to be deployed from vessels at sea. So there is an availability of the asset and an importance of the cost associated to this ecosystem exploration. Certainly, these assets were not there when the deep Red Sea exploration started. So this is a summary from 1996 of the historical explorations of the Red Sea, deep water exploration of the Red Sea, for example, based also on the German vessel Meteor. And you can see that the point explorations are there, but there was no way to visually assess at depth the benthic assemblages. In fact, the first accounts of deep Red Sea corals came from dredging, and it was only later in the year 2000 that the first accounts of visual assessment of Red Sea deep corals in Saudi Arabia were possible. When the cameras were finally able to reach the seafloor, it was clear that the red corals were there and most of them were unknown. Also, some of them were able to form frameworks. This is a framework discovered in the North Red Sea by Zwan et al. And what they observed is that the species forming this framework is not the same species, not one of the species that forms similar frameworks outside of the Red Sea. But most importantly, whatever species forms these frameworks at depth in the Red Sea, they live at incredible conditions compared to the outside of the Red Sea. So here in the CTD KAUST graph, you can see in red the temperature, and you can see the temperature at depth in the Red Sea. Here the graph goes from 0 to 800 meters depth. The temperature never goes below 21 degrees Celsius, which is quite extraordinary, because at 800 meters outside of the Red Sea, you would be already well below 10 or 8 degrees centigrade. If you look at the salinity, however, you are at increasing salinity as you go deep down in the Red Sea. Froukje showed you before the importance that salt has in the Red Sea and hypersaline environments have in the Red Sea. So it's clear that whatever coral builds any framework in the Red Sea lives in unique conditions. However, deep coral habitat exploration in the Saudi Arabia Red Sea was limited until 5 years ago to these 3 studies that I'm showing you here. So limited span of observation and limited geographical span in the Red Sea. I was extremely fortunate to join KAUST at the end of 2019, just before these 5 years of deep sea exploration in the Red Sea that occurred on different vessels and different expeditions. I'm extremely grateful to the lead scientists of each one of these explorations that allowed us to join, including Froukje here. What these assets at sea allowed us to collect is an unprecedented amount of data and information, from video transects collected from ROVs or submarines to CTD KAUSTs and high resolution bathymetry. We have been able to study the deep Red Sea biology in general and coral dominated habitats with data sets like never before. Moreover, and more importantly for this talk, we also were able to visually survey and directly sample a lot of fauna of organisms, of course, with a focus on the groups of corals that I just mentioned before. This allowed us with an unprecedented amount of information and data sets that we needed to analyze and digest to find out what discoveries we had made and how to publish them for the public. So if we have to summarize the Red Sea discoveries from 2020 to 2025, I would say that the major pointers are new deep sea habitats, and Froukje has shown you at length the amazing new deep sea habitats she has discovered. Those are not the only ones that were discovered, but the major ones at depth. New mesophotic and raryphotic coral ecosystems, new taxa from species to family level, most of them endemics, so only found in the Red Sea. New distribution records and new associations. So in the rest of my talk, I'm going to focus on these discoveries. And I will start with a discovery that happened actually in 2019 outside of the Red Sea in the Atlantic, where between the well-lit zone and the between the well-lit zone and the deep zone, I told you before that there is the mesophotic zone, kind of the twilight zone. Well, in 2019, researchers in the Atlantic in Curacao discovered the existence of a raryphotic zone. So yet another zone characterized by unique fish assemblages and coral assemblages that were less light dependent than the mesophotic ones, but still distinct from the shallower ones. We are in 2025 when we were able to finally publish our findings coming from 2020. And we are here just north of the city of Magna in the Gulf of Aqaba, so in the northern part of the Red Sea. And on the left-hand side here, you see a schematic representation of the coastline up here on top. The steep seafloor going down to 1,000 meters, and then a zoom in with the assets that were used for the exploration and sort of a drawing showing you this incredibly steep seafloor on which unprecedented diversity of reef growth has been discovered and described. So this is an actual raryphotic ecosystem like the one that was discovered recently outside of the Red Sea. The presence of these corals was not new. They had been reported in the 1980s in the Gulf of Aqaba. However, what is new that we were able to describe for the first time is actually the fact that these are completely new reef structures formed by ecosystem engineer species that are doing something that has never been seen before. So if you look at this coral, you see a lot of corals, you see the seafloor, and you go, okay. If you look at this kind of curated image, it's the same situation, but you see that on the sandstone bedrock, you have the living colony of the coral, and between the base of the colony and the sandstone, there is a part of the colony that looks like it's dead. It's not dead, it's covered by other organisms, mainly forams and bryozoans, that start to prime the colony while the coral is still alive and provide substrate for other organisms. And so it's like a micro reef information. And what that does in time, and we don't know how fast, is forming this kind of shelf-like reefs that aggregate a lot of biological diversity. Another shape of reef that we were able to observe is that of these columnar reefs. They're made by a different ecosystem engineer, Rhizopsamia compacta, here in a specimen on the right-hand side. And on the left-hand side, you see that the living colony is actually looking upside down. And what the stippled lines show you in the panel on the left-hand side is that each colony has been growing, pointing downwards and forming this kind of, I never know if it's a stalactite or a stalagmite, but it's basically a column shape structure. Froukje is laughing at me, correctly so, for my ignorance. And these columns all together form a sort of a curtain of a reef that's an upside down reef. And again, composed by corals that are absolutely different from the ones found in the Mesophotic. So here you have a comparison in terms of benthic assemblages composition between the Mesophotic in the Red Sea. You see on the top picture, there's a lot of pink there. Those are crustus coralline algae, they're light dependent. And in the bottom, you see that the pink is actually depending on the corals, but the seafloor is actually grayish and is covered in the same forams and bryozoans that I showed you in the previous picture. A huge diversity of associated invertebrates. I'm only focusing on the corals here because they're quite visual and they're what we're focusing on right now. Suffice to say that at least a third of these species are probably new, and we're in the slow process of describing them. So there is this unique structure, but there is also this unique biodiversity associated. Now, as we move deep towards the deeper part of the Red Sea, we found the same frameworks that were already discovered by our colleagues 5 or 6 years ago, but we also found which was never documented before, a huge amount of associated biodiversity of vertebrates and invertebrates. These are definitely tougher to sample and characterize than the corals. Corals, you know, are animals but function mostly like seafloor dwellers, and they look like rocks sometimes. But these organisms are much harder to sample, so we're slowly catching up on sampling these organisms too, but we're not there yet. That's why I'm also focusing on coral with you today. In the Mesophotic and Deep Red Sea, another reef builder is the endemic species Madrachis interjecta. And because we had so much bathymetry, so much videos, observation, we knew this species already. We knew it was an endemic. It was one of the ones described in the 1900s from the first dredging operations in the Red Sea. But what we wanted to find out is how much habitat in the Deep Red Sea is suitable for the formation of these habitats, of these structures. And so that's what my student Megan Nolan did, providing for the first time suitability habitat maps for deep Red Sea deep corals for Madrachis interjecta and other two groups of corals. Turns out there's quite a lot of suitable habitat in the deep Red Sea. And this means that from the carbonate budget production, corals in the deep Red Sea are much more relevant than we thought they were up until 5 years ago. The corals that don't produce frameworks are just as interesting and probably more diverse. In fact, this is a picture from one of the recently accepted papers from my student Laura Macrina. She provided the first extensive assessment based on morphology and molecular analysis of the octocorals and sea fans in the Red Sea. Turns out there are at least 10 new genera record in the Red Sea based on this survey. So it means that up until now, there's been a lot of underestimation of the deep Red Sea coral diversity based mainly on two reasons. The first one is the lack of exploration, of course, but the second is always this idea that because the Red Sea was so warm and hypersaline at depth, probably deep water organisms wouldn't live there. Maybe true in some cases, but definitely not in others. And then the pride and joy, we're getting from nerdy to nerdier here, the description of new species. And all the new species that we have found in the Red Sea are actually deep Red Sea endemics. Here, a black coral, Bachypates thermophila, discovered mainly from the North Red Sea once more. The first record of a lace coral or stylosterid from the Red Sea. Now, when we describe new species, we normally try to integrate the morphology of the animal, both in situ and from the specimens we collected, mostly looking at the microscopic detail with scanning electron microscope, and then we pair also the molecular analysis. And so these two independent lines of evidence help us to say this is a new species. And then corals, as I mentioned, aggregate diversity. So when we sample corals, we willingly or unwillingly also sample other organisms associated to them. And we were lucky enough to have in our team a well-renowned crustacean specialist, Dr. Arthur Anker, who has examined the crustacean collections from the explorations done between 2020 and 2025. And he has described, and is still describing, new species of crustaceans endemic to the Red Sea associated to the deep corals. Last but not least, going from shallow to deep, this is the deepest coral we have found in the Red Sea, and I much have to thank Froukje for this because most of the specimens come from her cruises and her willingness to collect very small corals. This is a close-up of this depth generalist coral, which is a new species, new genus, and new family. Nowadays, it's not so normal to find and discover new families. Pretty big deal for a zoologist. And this is a spoiler alert, is a very preliminary tree showing you new family level lineages that are from specimens from the deep Red Sea. And you can see there are 7 new families of corals from the Red Sea. And this little guy is just one of the 7. So we have much work to do. And we will continue analyzing the wealth of information that's being collected because this fundamental information is very important for the policy makers and the stakeholders to decide how to better protect the Red Sea. But we also advocate for more studies on connectivity, recruitment, reproduction, and most importantly, growth rates to try to understand how fragile these corals are and how fast they can recover in case of mechanical damage. Many people contributed to these results, and many more are working on this data, and I'm deeply indebted to each one of them, Froukje included, of course, my partner in crime. Thank you for your attention. You're muted, Murtadha.
Oh, thank you.
Happens to the best.
Yes, thank you very much for your amazing presentation. Now we will open the floor for questions. So we are streaming here on Zoom and also on YouTube, and we're receiving questions from both. So I would like to start with the more general questions and then more specific. Okay, first question is, are there any similar areas when it comes to both geology and biodiversity to the Red Sea and other oceans, specifically in the Indian Ocean?
Froukje.
So from a geological perspective, and maybe I take the oceanography with it directly, not really. There are a few places on Earth where we have young oceans, so young oceans being formed, but none of those are like the Red Sea, which is partially enclosed, which is high temperature. So the seawater, as Francesca mentioned, it's down to 2,000, 3,000 meters. We have 20 degrees. So if you could go there, you could happily swim around. You don't find that anywhere else. And this combination of all some of the things you can find somewhere else, also hydrothermal vent fields you can find in other locations, both high temperature, low temperature. but the combination of this enclosed ocean, young ocean, warm waters, saline ocean, all this together is something which we only find in the Red Sea. There is one place where we may had very similar conditions, but then 100 million years ago, and that is the Atlantic. So the margins of the Atlantic started very similar as the Red Sea, with salt and things like that. So if we try to understand the Red Sea now or the Atlantic 100 million years ago, we can actually make some parallels. But the current, the present place, the Red Sea, is really unique from a geological point of view. And I think Francesca can say something about the biology.
Yeah, absolutely. Everything that Froukje just said, the unique environmental conditions have driven the evolution of the organisms. And so it's really a mirroring situation. The uniqueness of the environment has shaped, together with the isolation, the uniqueness of the organisms. Now, let's be honest, we have not sampled the Indian Ocean, and I would very much like to, with the same sampling effort that we have deployed in the last 5 years, at least in the Red Sea. So we know that the conditions are different, for sure. We know that some of the species in the Red Sea are only Red Sea endemic, but for others, in order to say that, we really would need to go and sample with the same kind of tools and sampling effort deployed in the Indian Ocean. And that's something that I would love to do in the next years, for example.
Yeah, thank you. And I heard before that due to the special environment in the Red Sea, that even the coral reefs that are there, when it comes to their sensitivity to climate change and global warming, they're special compared to other oceans. And there are several species in the Red Sea that might only exist in the Red Sea. I don't know, but could you please clarify on that?
Yes, so both in the shallow and the deep, we have this uniqueness of corals. We're finding out more about the deep, but also the shallow is under revision. And again, we use that molecular, morphological, ecological combination of approach that I mentioned before. So for a long time, up until very, very recently, the idea was that because the Red Sea shallow water corals had evolved to adapt to the unique conditions of the Red Sea, they somehow held the secret to the resilience and the resistance to global change, global climate change, and recurrent waves of heat coming in the ocean. Whilst that still holds true, especially for the northern part of the Red Sea that's cooler, we're starting to see some serious degradation in the south and in the center. So times are catching up, and also in the Red Sea, it still is diverse and unique, and we still can unlock several secrets on how corals evolve and can resist, but it's the time, the clock is ticking.
And a very specific question coming from Brazil.
Wow.
Saying, what can we learn from the research that is being done on the Red Sea that could be applied to studies in the deep ocean in Brazil?
So, well, I just mentioned already the Atlantic, and Brazil is really the margin of the former young ocean, very similar as the Red Sea, actually. So a lot of geological processes are probably very similar. So that is what we can learn from a pure geological perspective. Of course, there are several processes that are similar in different oceans. So volcanic areas, hydrothermal activity, that is something which occurs both in the Red Sea, but also in places like in Brazil. And there are some places where there may or may not be young volcanoes. The origin of the volcanoes may be slightly different, but some of these processes, and particularly the interaction between the geological process and the biology, this is something which worldwide has not been studied in so much detail. So many studies are quite focused on their own discipline, and some of the work that we do here in the Red Sea, trying to combine these things, and also with Ocean Quest actually now looking at seamounts, connecting things, is something what can be applied worldwide and can give insights from the Red Sea to the Atlantic and vice versa.
From the
Okay.
biological point of view, there are two very, very different regions of the world with very distant stories, but that's the beauty of it. Because when you look at biogeography, so the study of the distribution of organisms today and in the past around the planet, we're going and looking for, climatic, geological, environmental changes in time and space to understand the patterns of distribution today. And what we know today about marine biota in general, not just corals, all the marine biota, is that the Atlantic province is very, very different from the Indo-Pacific province. And the Red Sea is, at the periphery of the Indo-Pacific province. Moreover, Brazil is below a very important biogeographical barrier for temperate corals, which is the Orinoco Amazon plume output of a freshwater and sediment. So it's super interesting how different these bodies of water are. However, there are lineages that in the history of evolution have been able to colonize both places. And so studying that evolution would probably allow us to unlock more about, more knowledge about the history in our planet. So it's never far enough, I would say, not to be interesting to compare.
Awesome. And we have a question from Frank Carger. The question is, are there examples that highlight the importance of biodiversity, the unique geology and geography, as well as the ecosystem services that illustrate why and how local states should support these efforts? So can we highlight such stories?
Yes, I take this one, Froukje. So the paper that I showed you at the beginning of my blah blah, the one on the rariphotic unique coral ecosystems in the rariphotic of Neom, we discovered them in 2020, and it took us a lot of work to finally publish them in 2025. However, we knew that was one of the major development projects going on in the kingdom on the coast, right in front of these unique ecosystems. And so we worked with the authorities, with the developers, to highlight the presence of this unique ecosystem, and they were included in their marine spatial planning before the paper even took place. So the uniqueness of these ecosystems has been understood, captured, and highlighted in the marine spatial planning of one of the major development projects in the world. So it's always worth explaining stakeholders and developers, what's there, what's unique, because it's always a resource, even if you don't directly mine it or sell it, but it's something unique that you have in your premises, in your backyard, or in your deep backyard. So you want to highlight it.
Yes. A follow-up on that is, so what do you think is the best way to highlight it, how to get the authorities interested, whether here in Saudi with these mega projects that are happening, and other states, Red Sea states, we have like Egypt, Sudan, and the southern states. How can you highlight that, and what kind of challenges you could face when trying to explain the importance of this work to them?
Quickly. There is a unwritten rule in science that it doesn't exist until you publish it. So first of all, publish it. But in the meantime, as you have the evidence, even if the evidence is still not published, communicate. What we're doing here with Froukje today is showing to the wider public, thanks to Ocean Quest, what's been discovered, and it's still being studied in the last 5 years. And as she said, and I said, tons of data are still, being analyzed and munched upon by our students. And we're already sharing this with the wider public, because this is what counts.
Yeah.
The conservation of the deep ecosystems is so much more challenging than the shallow water ones or the terrestrial ones, because they're away from the eyes, and as we say in Italy, away from the eyes, away from the heart. So you cannot care about something that you have never seen. And so our job is to make the deep resources seen to everyone, so that they can care, that they can act on them. So that's our responsibility, I think, as fundamental scientists.
Okay, and yes, go ahead. Okay, sorry.
One thing, there was earlier a comment in the chat about it's only video data, but especially this video data, sharing that with people worldwide is so the videos that we've seen from these places, they are, it's like being out in space, right? It's so different. So and if you never seen that, you can try to explain it like, oh, it's nice, oh, it's there's this or there's something new. But actually seeing this kind of videos and images, I think that is what's really bringing the message also that even on Earth, we have lots of things to explore still. And the Red Sea, or the Red Sea in general, but especially the deep sea worldwide, is one of the last frontiers on Earth where we know so little of. There's only
Careful about just videos, because videos, if they have a scale, a GPS point, and a depth, are data. So you can extract that data, you can put an AI algorithm to extract that data, you can quantify patterns of distribution. A video is a very powerful tool.
Oh, thank you. Actually, directly related to this point, I have a question from Cesar Toro. So about what can we learn from this effort, observation effort versus anchored effort or floating devices? So what's the added value? So what's the difference that you can learn from this that you cannot learn from the others?
From what, sorry?
From with these observation efforts where we go into the deep ocean, what's different from these efforts to the anchored and floating devices? So why do you need to use all of these assets?
So I can say something from a geological point of view.
Yes.
Rocks don't move typically. So a fish maybe will float by a camera, or also water is flowing, a rock doesn't. So well anchored things, or floating, or also things you put on the seafloor and then collect, they are giving you a lot of information about time. So you can monitor a certain area for a certain time. You can get high resolution information on even on geology via earthquakes, or on water currents, or on animals going by, changes in temperature, salinity, all those kind of parameters. But it's always a spot. It's one location. And these are definitely studies which are very much needed, and that we're also looking into, trying to get this time component in our studies. But at the moment, there's many places in the deep sea that we have not seen at all. So before you start with spot points, you want to get an overview of what's there. And then based on that, you want to look for the most interesting places to try to capture more a time change or things like that. So I think both of these efforts are really need to go hand in hand, and can complement each other.
Yes, I'm guessing also, especially when it comes to sampling, and rocks
Yes.
are,
Yes.
those rocks are very deep. And this brings me to the next question from Dorentina Gashi. A question to Professor Zwan. So you mentioned that recent data shows no evidence of continental contamination. Can you briefly describe what evidence of continental contamination would you look for to compare in terms of chemistry?
So continental crust and oceanic crust has a very different chemistry. So, and if we would have contamination of continental crust in a magma that is forming our oceanic crust, then you add a little bit of this different chemistry, which is mostly very enriched in all sort of trace elements. You would add that to our oceanic crust, and because that is low in trace elements, you quickly would increase these elements. And so that are certain element ratios. I don't want to go into too much detail here now, but that are signatures that you can find in an oceanic crust if there is any continent nearby. And in the Red Sea, we did not find any of these evidences. So to us, that means continental crust is not anywhere close to where we have sampled, at least.
Thank you. Another question from Rick Lutz from Rutgers University. I noticed a number of anemones in the videos and at least one anemone being sampled. How common are anemones in the, it's a hard word, in the deep portions of the Red Sea? And And have any anemones been found in areas of hydrothermal venting in the Red Sea?
You've done a great job, Murtadha, really have.
Thank you.
Yes, so those white chunky anemones that were both in Froukje's images and mine are quite common. It looks like it's only one species, but I wouldn't know which one. We have sampled them to the great peril of the handling on the ship. Some people got really stung by them. And they are being analyzed. We have not a good idea of what they are, but they're quite common. I would never say abundant, so you would never find fields of them, but on an average dive in the deep, you would find at least one. That's my experience, and I think that Froukje nodding suggests that that's the same.
Yeah, there are some places where we really didn't find anything, but especially around the hydrothermal vent fields, there were quite a few in the shallower areas mostly, but there were quite a few around, and they were happily sitting there.
Froukje doesn't really care. She doesn't want to say it, but she doesn't care about the animals.
No, I like the animals around the hydrothermal vent fields. I would not necessarily need to sample them, but yeah, we work together on this.
Another question from Cesar Toro. Which were the major challenges that you had in your efforts to access national jurisdiction waters? Going to the EEZ of a certain country.
So we live in Saudi Arabia, and we are a Saudi Arabian university. Within here, we have very good networks, regulations. There's a good connection between the university and the government. So as long as you prepare your preparations, your documents in time, we never had really any issue. Of course, working in other countries requires access to the governments of other countries. In some of our expeditions, we have worked together with other countries, mostly because it is already very difficult to try to get access, or not try to get access, but to have equipment and ships. We try to not complicate it too much, and so mostly we have focused on Saudi waters because there's still so much to discover there. But yes, one of the next steps I think would be crossing across into other countries as well.
Yeah, so just to point out, obviously neither Froukje nor I are Saudis, right? So we are guests in the country and we work there, but in most of the cruises, there were also representatives of the local ministries. NCW, National Center for Wildlife, comes to mind, Saudi students. So we're representing a larger workforce on board these vessels. And as Froukje said, our university has a government affairs office that ensures that the relevant national bodies are not only informed, but also involved to access the marine resources. And so far, we've been very fortunate, I would say.
Thank you. And I would like to comment. I've been into several of these expeditions in the Red Sea and in the Ocean X missions in the Red Sea and also in the Indian Ocean. And one of the things that I learned from these expeditions, which complements what Professor Benzoni said about the highlighting the importance of these efforts and communicating with the authorities, is that it's very important to get the authorities as part of the mission, get them included, which is what we did in the Indian Ocean with the Madagascar government. That's if you include those countries in your work, they understand what you're trying to do, and then it becomes much easier. So it's a very good point that you need to highlight all of that. We have another question from Jennifer Richards. Is there any publicly available video footage from these rarephotic areas for others to view and study? It is so amazing to have a new coral family. Anthozoa nerds unite.
Yes, absolutely. You cannot bark up a more perfect tree for that. There are videos that have been deposited. I'm not sure they're publicly available yet. And most of the reasons is that there's still other species that are being described. And so we're kind of being careful about that. Also, the video is not ours. So it's not KAUST IP. It's NEOM's IP in this case. And so it becomes tricky in sharing. They're very willing to share, but it's time consuming to ask for permission and make sure that everything is streamlined. So we're in the process of doing that. Yes, the new families, general and species are amazing. Are, you know, what makes me happy about my job on top of my students. Big thank to them for all this work, but it's also a lot of work and it's a long process. And I often, as a taxonomist, I often get the question, so do we need to know every single, you know, new species? Do we need to have all the names to be able to protect the corals and the reefs? Absolutely not. Okay, it's important to name things properly, but that's not the point. You know, we highlight the ecosystem and the habitat because that is what, you know, needs to go first in the eyes of the authority. And then, of course, the new species are very cool.
Awesome. And you guys talked about the logistics a lot of these efforts. And Cesar Toro has another question, which is, would you agree that this effort could help us develop a better strategy to define the sampling areas in the deep ocean? Say the question again. Yes. Would you agree that this effort could help us to develop a better strategy to define the sampling areas in the deep ocean?
Yes, because it's the fundamental exploration that leads to, you know, basic discoveries that drive then more pointed studies. So what Froukje and I showed today, it's the first step. It's by no means what we want to do for the rest of our lives in the Red Sea. We're very excited about, you know, getting to discover new places, but the questions you want to ask are others, are about temporal dynamics, are about functions, are about interactions, all questions that we cannot answer unless we know where the resources, where the rocks, where the animals are. So we now are finding out where resources are, so we can physically go and, for example, deploy devices, loggers, recruitment places, so that we can go back in time and see how things change in time. You know, we have a snapshot, a very huge snapshot, and we're very lucky to have that, but it's just the first step. And that data collected after that will be the one that will be able to push stakeholders towards, you know, actions.
Yeah, so even if our efforts here have been a lot for the Red Sea already, it's still only a fraction of what we have done. And with each little detail that we learn, for example, hydrothermal vent fields, we now try to understand what geological features are they related to? Are they related to specific volcanic or tectonic features? And then you can go back to the information that we have from the bathymetry. And then you can look for other areas where you can find these kind of things and where you would focus your next steps on. And similarly with the biology, if we can, I think Francesca actually had a student working on that, starting with what do we know, using AI methods to try to identify locations that are potentially have other large areas, big habitats, and then you could focus your next efforts there again.
Yeah.
Thank you. And with this, I have a general question now. So with this increasing effort that Saudi Arabia is putting into the exploration of the Red Sea and other older oceanic bodies, whether through governmental effort, through the collaboration of Ocean Quest, which is a new foundation, along with KAUST and their collaborators, are there any programs or efforts in place that would support the growing population of young scholars, whether within Saudi or abroad?
That's a great question. And I think this is a right place for me as a member of the marine science program in KAUST to say we need more Saudis. We need more Saudi students in the marine science program, because I think that, you know, historically, marine science has never been seen as a potential career path for nationals and for MENA region young people. We need this. Like one of our mandate here at KAUST is to try to help the new generation of people regionally to get into this kind of science, to understand that they can find a job. Actually, you know, the ministries and the Giga project constantly ask us, I need to hire one of your students, you know, and there's not enough of them because there's so much to do. So definitely, we're advocating for more nationals to apply and to engage in this. And it doesn't necessarily need to be because you want to become a scientist, you know, it's because you want to be a science communicator, because you want to be an advocate, because you want to go into industry. There's many career paths that start with fundamental science.
And not only marine science, but also, of course, the earth science, which looks at partially similar topics from a different side. And also, we represent now the biology and the geology, but we also here in KAUST, we have people working on technology of the deep oceans, communication underwater, all sort of things which are cables underwater, which is like a completely different topic, but it's still highly relevant and has to do with the deep ocean. So at KAUST, we definitely have a lot of options, of course, for young scholars to learn. Apart from the classical studying pathway, there are also programs in KAUST that are more related to training kind of programs. So there's more short terms program, and with Ocean Quest now there will hopefully be a lot of new programs in the future also that can help students, scholars, or also kids in school to get excited about these kind of topics and see that the deep sea is not just a scary, unknown, dark place, but that there's actually lots of creatures, and creatures in a good sin.
Value, I would say. Value and value for knowledge and for management.
Yes,
Yeah.
and honestly, I could vouch for that. As a Saudi national, I did most of my work inland, but through you guys, thank you for the opportunities, and for Ocean Quest for giving me the opportunity to go and explore whether the Red Sea, and also latest in the earlier this year in the Indian Ocean, getting the chance to learn about mapping, deep ocean, learning about using ROVs, leading missions there. We can see that there are a lot of efforts happening right now to support the young scholars in Saudi to be part of these efforts. But next to this, there's another question that's very more specific to foreigners, which is, I've heard that KAUST is like Disneyland for scientists. So as a foreign scholar, as a young scholar, young professional, how can I become part of these exploration opportunities provided by KAUST and Ocean Quest? Froukje, you talked about that there in the future there are going to be programs, but are there anything happening now at KAUST that I can actually apply to? What comes to my mind is like the visiting student program.
So
How
of
can they
course,
take advantage of that? Yes.
yes, there's of course the option to apply for a master or a PhD student, or also for postdocs. These are KAUST is a very international university, so we want more Saudis. We also want still international students. It's a combination of the both which makes KAUST so special, that we really integrate different knowledge, different disciplines, different cultures all together. And then apart from the more formal path, there is also the option for internships. There are different types of internships. There is internships for really PhD students, collaborative work. There's internships to try out if you like KAUST. There's also specific internships. I think they're mostly for Saudi students though, which is for like summer schools, or even for students at high school that want to visit KAUST. So there is lots of things going on, and the best way to find these things is go to the KAUST website, browse around,
Student
and try
affairs.
to find some of these things. If there's someone that has a specific question, like I would like to do this, you can also contact us. But the first start is really go to the KAUST website, because there's lots and lots of information on how to get connected to KAUST to find there.
Our graduate affair office is very good, and they're very responsive and very generous in terms of time that they devote to answering questions like this. I would also say, yes, it is an amazing place to work. Yes, it is a Disneyland for scientists, but it's quite a selective process to get in. So there's the admission committees look at the background, at the GPA. The selection process is there. It's not for everyone, but for most that want to work hard and take advantage of the incredible opportunities we are given every day.
Thank you, Professor Zwan. Thank you, Professor Benzoni. We come to the end of our webinar. We talked about the uniqueness of the Red Sea, about the deep Red Sea from the points of geology and biodiversity. We talked about the logistics. We talked about the exciting efforts that are happening in the Red Sea and the exploration of older oceans as well. Thank you for the participants who came and joined us. Thank you for the amazing questions, and hopefully we see you in the future for future webinars. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.